Yeah, I just had to re-put them back in. I don't know why.
Okay. Oh, good evening. Welcome in. We do have a handout tonight. Maybe I'll just divide them in half. Just pass them back. It's yellow. Welcome to class. If you don't know, we've been studying through the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We're in Numbers. And I think we'll be there in Numbers for, a few more weeks maybe. Not going through it, obviously, verse by verse. Numbers is a long book, but trying to hit some highlights. We're going to start looking at some of the stories in Numbers. There's some great stories in Numbers. And it being a book that we tend not to read and study much, we can miss these, so I want to make sure we're exposed to them. Hopefully we'll get to some of them tonight. And we'll talk a little bit about that info on that handout too. All right, let's ask God's blessings on our time. Holy Father, we pray in your presence tonight. We're grateful that you always hear us. We pray that we'll use our time wisely this evening in your word, that you will help us to learn things and be encouraged and strengthened in our faith. May that be the case throughout the building this morning in our different classes. Please bless us as a church to be your people truly and faithfully in this community, and help us through this busy season right now to be a good witness of your Son. Pray your blessings on all those in special need tonight. And thank you for your love. In Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, so Numbers, we did a little bit of introduction over the last couple of weeks. And where we ended up at the end of last week was we were sort of looking at places that the book of Numbers shows up in the New Testament, which we may not always be aware of. There's several places, and we had read through one of those quickly at the end, trying to jam in as much as we can before the bell rings, that kind of thing. And I want to go back to that because that's an important passage, I think, to begin tonight. So it was in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and basically the opening paragraph of that chapter, 1 Corinthians 10. So we looked at some of this last week, but just want us to remember that when Paul begins this chapter, he says, I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers, and he's talking about, of course, their Jewish fathers, their ancestors in Israel, that they were all under the cloud. We talked about, the cloud being the cloud that followed them in the wilderness, that represented God's presence, and all passed through the sea, that is the Red Sea, where they were rescued from the Egyptian armies. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And so here Paul starts talking sort of figuratively, right? So they were, if you think about Israel's salvation in the Exodus, God led them through the wilderness with a cloud, and he delivered them at the Red Sea. And now Paul says it's similar to your salvation. They were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. You have a baptism, is sort of the idea. Sort of, speaking in one sense figuratively. And then he says, and all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. So food and drink being a big issue in the wilderness, of course. They're always complaining about we don't have water. And then when they do have water, we don't have food. And we don't like the food we've got, which I think we'll get to that passage tonight. But, food and drink that he's talking about with the Corinthians, of course, would be, the spiritual food and so forth. It says, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Remember, the wilderness, God bringing water from the rock to save them, to give them water. And now he's drawing a parallel and saying, your rock, of course, is Jesus, that kind of thing. And he says in verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now he gets into the warning for the Corinthians, using this Old Testament example of Israel. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. For it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. That's a direct quote from Exodus 32. Moses up on the mountain, getting the law, and they're down below, building a golden calf. And this exact phrase, they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Not play in a fun way, but play before the idol and so forth. And so that one's from Exodus. Then he says in verse 8, we must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Now we'll look at that story in Numbers. That's a reference to a story in Numbers. And then verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. That is from Numbers 21. And that's something that Jesus himself refers to and parallels it to something he's going to do in John chapter 3 when he's talking to Nicodemus. So we'll get to that eventually. I don't know about tonight, but that's from Numbers 21. And then verse 10, no, we must not grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. And then the famous verse, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. But it's just interesting how there's like 4 or 5 or 6 references here to the wilderness time, but Paul's taken all that and applying it to the Corinthians in the first century. See? And so in a similar way, what we're doing here, all these centuries later, even from the Corinthians, we're reading these stories in Numbers because of the spiritual benefit and learning we can achieve, okay, by drawing parallels and so forth. So just doing what Paul did, and it's still the case that these things were written down for our instruction and for our example. Another place, just 2 more New Testament links. John chapter 1, verse 14, which is probably a verse you have memorized, which says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Remember that verse? Okay, talking of Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word, at least in my translation, says dwelt. Okay? The word actually means set up a tent. It's the word that means to put up a tent. In fact, I think in some older translations, they may say tabernacled or something like that in that verse. Chapter 1, verse 14 of John. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Remember, the tabernacle was a tent, right? Okay, so I don't know what you think of when you see John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but we have to sort of remember what the wilderness setup was like. I gave you this sheet. Mine's white, yours is yellow. It shows how the camp was organized. All right, so notice how you have all the tribes of Israel. They have their own assigned place where they camp. So that's all the names on the outside. And then what's right in the middle? The tabernacle, God's tent. Okay, so when John says, the Word, that is Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us, he's expecting us to be able to recall, well, that's what God did in the wilderness. He dwelt amongst Israel in a tent. Made his dwelling. That's a good rendering of it too, yeah. So that's the idea. He put on flesh to be among us, to be close to us. And it plays off of this imagery in Numbers and in the wilderness. Notice on that, the top half of that sheet, you have the way the camp was normally set up, but when it was time to move, which they often moved, right? Then there's also instructions given them, this is how you move. It's an organized thing, in a certain order that the tribes marched, and here's where you carry the tabernacle, here's where you carry the ark, and all that stuff. It's all organized, and you can read all this in Numbers chapters 2 and 10 that tell them how to move when it's time to move. All right. So that's what those two at the top of that page is. The other place is in the other New Testament link is John chapter 3, verse 14. Again, Jesus is here in discussion with Nicodemus. Remember? Of course, the famous verse is verse 16. For God so loved the world, right? But before that, the Lord said to Nicodemus in verse 14, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. That is a reference to Numbers chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. It's the story where they had a problem with serpents, and they made a bronze serpent, and we'll look at the details of that when we get to it. But Jesus, just refers to that to Nicodemus, obviously expecting this man who is a teacher among the Jews to know, right? He doesn't have to stop and say, turn to Numbers 21. He knew it when he talked about Moses lifting up the serpent. And it would be a very visual thing for Nicodemus to say, oh, what does he mean he's going to be lifted up? Right? Well, maybe he didn't understand at the time, but we know this has an impact on him because where's one place Nicodemus comes back in the story of Jesus? After he went to the cross, right? And to deal with the body of Jesus. So Nicodemus, over a period of time, becomes a believer in Jesus. Starts with this conversation here in John 3. And I don't think by the end of John 3 he's a follower, but there's another time where Nicodemus speaks up, and then we have him coming all the way out at the end. To step up and ask for the body of the Lord, he couldn't hide anymore that he was Jesus' follower. So that's an interesting story, just to trace Nicodemus through all that. But this is one of the places where the Lord influences him. So those are some of the major ones that are linked to in the New Testament from Numbers. Now, just a little bit more on, so Numbers, if you look at the first 10 chapters, just a little bit more on the organization here. These opening chapters, basically, they're preparing to go to the Promised Land. It's preparations to go to the Promised Land here in the first 10 chapters. Getting organized to move. and to go to where God had prepared a place for them, moving from Sinai to Canaan. And these 10 chapters, if you look at the beginning and end, it's about a 2-month period covered in these 10 chapters. Then it's going to really slow down in the middle section. It's going to be 40 years instead of a couple of months. But the first thing that happens in this preparation in chapter 1 is what? What do they do? It's where the book gets its name. Census. They take a census of the people in chapter 1. Now, in the Old Testament, when you take a census, that means one thing. You're getting ready to go to war. Because they want to find out how many soldiers do we have. You might remember there's a story of King David taking a census, and God is very upset. Sends a plague on the people. Because basically, the writer of that story doesn't spell it out and say, David was preparing to go to war. He just expects us to know that when you take a census in Israel, you're counting soldiers. Okay? Fighting men. That's what you want to find out. And it's legit here in Numbers 1 because they're going to be traveling through enemy territory. So you get this census in chapter 1 of Numbers. There's going to be a second census toward the end of the book because the population will have changed in Israel because a bunch of people are going to die. So we get a second one in chapter 26 of Numbers. But they count the people. Chapter 1, they do another thing that's really a prep for war in chapter 5, and that is they purify the people. They go through purification rituals, which you had to do in Israel before you went to war. See, war was like a holy thing. War that God calls for. It was like a religious thing almost. So you had to purify, and so they purify in chapter 5. They're told how to organize the camp, which I showed you there on that handout. That's in chapter 2. How to set up the camp. How to transport the camp is in chapter 4. So just a lot of stuff about moving. There's one little section I want us to read because I just think it's fascinating. Over in chapter 9 of Numbers. Chapter 9 and verse 15. I always thought this would be an interesting passage to a sermon on. This says something about God and how he relates to his people. So notice, on the day the tabernacle was set up, so they got the thing built and set up. The cloud covered the tabernacle. Again, the cloud is telling us what? God's there. Right? All right. Cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and at evening it was over the tabernacle like the appearance of fire until morning. Right, so cloud during the day, fire at night. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. But then notice verse 17, and whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, after that the people of Israel set out. So how do they know when to move? When it's time to... When God moves, they move. Right? When the cloud moves, it's time to pack up and move. This is how they know. They don't make the decision. There's a time or two that they do, and they get in all kinds of trouble. So you only move when God moves. So that was verse 16, or verse 17. Whenever the cloud lifted, after that the people of Israel set out, And in the place where the cloud settled down, there the people of Israel camped. So he tells them when to move and when to stop. Does that make sense? I think there's a parallel there for our lives. Right? I'll let you preach that sermon. At the command of the Lord, the people of Israel set out, and at the command of the Lord they camped. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. Notice how Moses keeps repeating. Right? He says it about 5 different times. It must be really important. Even when the cloud continued over the tabernacle many days, the people of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not set out. So if it stayed for a long time, they stayed a long time. Sometimes the cloud was a few days over the tabernacle, and according to the command of the Lord, they remained in camp. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they set out. So sometimes it was a long time, sometimes it was a short time. And sometimes the cloud remained from evening until morning. And when the cloud lifted in the morning, they set out. Or if it continued for a day and a night, when the cloud lifted, they set out. See how it keeps repeating it? Whether it was 2 days or a month or a longer time, that the cloud continued over the tabernacle, abiding there, then the people of Israel remained in camp and did not set out. But when it lifted, they set out. At the command of the Lord they camped, and at the command of the Lord they set out. They kept the charge of the Lord at the command of the Lord by Moses. Hard to miss the point, right? We move when God moves. We stop when God stops. Okay? So that gets them moving toward Canaan. All right? The middle section of the book, the next section, 11. Oh, there was a bunch, wasn't there?
Well, the census said there were 600,000 males, not counting Levites, but Levites were counted different.
Right.
And theirs were counted, I don't quite understand why, all the others were counted from the age of 20 up. But when you did the Levites, they were from 1 month old up.
I'd have to go back and look at it. There is some difference in, because they're given different job.
Yeah, and that's what I was wondering, I guess they never were counted to those soldiers or defense.
Right.
But they counted every male from 1 month old up, and they had 7,500, and the other had 600,000 and some. And you're not counting women and children. Children didn't know. But that many people setting out on foot, I mean, first ones would be stopping for
Yeah.
the back of the train.
Quite a
Or they would keep,
quite a production.
yeah.
Yeah.
I understand, with God, nothing's impossible, but for someone who's trying to understand this, who doesn't have faith,
They think it's ridiculous. Yeah.
because how far could they move? Because
Mm-hmm.
600,000
How do you do it?
on foot.
How do you do it in an ancient time when you don't have all the modern? And that is a point of criticism of these stories, is that these numbers are ridiculous. It can't be this many. A lot of skeptics will say, of course, there's all kinds of things from the ancient world they can't explain. I was just reading today about the temple in Jerusalem, the temple that was there when Jesus was there, has just some stones that are nearly as big as this auditorium. And they to this day, they don't know how they cut them so precisely and move them on hilly terrain. Well, they haven't figured that out yet. So, or how do they do it, right? Had to be aliens. You know, that's what aliens, that's what they say on TV. Had to be aliens, you know. Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
Trickle down, it's like traffic jams, when it opens up, people's back are slowly going. It's more of mentality.
A lot. And that's just the soldiers. There's more than them. Yes?
Maybe this is a good parallel or not, but if you've ever run in a marathon or half marathon, if you're in the back, you're not, they have queues, and there could be 30-some queues.
Right.
So you start the race a half hour to 45 minutes after the first runners who have the best time to go. So I can imagine, like Becky said, they'd be already ready to camp.
Right.
Before the other people might even start.
But you can see why this thing had to be organized. Right.
It was having the cloud, and no one really plowed, and you didn't have to get the word out. They saw the cloud, and they're like, okay, everybody has to pack up, so you didn't have to break
Right.
to get the word out. It would take 2 days to get
And something big and in the air that they could all track and follow.
The one thing is, if the clouds stop, it may then to stop the front, so the back can get
I think there were a lot of miracles in the wilderness. There's a verse, I can't quote the passage yet, or the place, but that says, God says, in the wilderness, you remember those 40 years you never had to buy new shoes. That's not the way it says, but it's your shoes never wore out. Okay? So that, to me, that's a miracle. So there, a lot of, and just the provision of food and all those things, just amazing. But that didn't keep them from complaining, which is what the middle chapters of Numbers are all about. All the complaining, murmuring, rebellions here in this middle section, which, is 40 years of wandering. And it's 40 years instead of a few months because of the complaining and the rebellion. But this is the complaints section. And this is where all these stories are that are interesting, that we referred to. This first generation, they're not going to be able to see the end of this. They're not going to be able to see Canaan, the promised land, remember, because they don't believe that God can take them up into the land successfully. Remember, they send spies up into the land, and only 2 come back saying, yeah, we can do it. What are those 2 fellows' names? Joshua and Caleb, right? But the others prevail, saying, no, there are giants up there, we can't do this. Although God had told them, it's ready for you, all you got to do is move in, basically. They listened to the skeptics, and so that generation, this is their last hurrah here, 40 years in the wilderness. They all die out, except for Caleb and Joshua. Die in the wilderness. It's only the generation born in the wilderness that's going to get to go in to Canaan at the end of this. So let's look at the first of the major murmurings or complaints, which is in chapter 11. Because this sort of sets the pattern for the rest. Chapter 11, verse 1. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, what happened? He's angry. All right? It really hasn't even got that bad yet, you see. This is right at the beginning. And they're complaining, the Lord is upset. His anger is kindled. It's very interesting in the original language, Hebrew. The language there is, his nose got hot. That's the what do we call it, figure of speech for getting angry in Hebrew. Your nose gets hot. All right. which makes sense. You ever seen somebody red-faced? Yeah. His anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Remember the setup of the camp. God's in the middle of it. He's angry. There's a burning. Doesn't detail it. All we know is that some of the edges of the camp gets burnt up. Then the people cried out to Moses. And Moses prayed to the Lord, and what happened? Fire died down. Okay? So the name of that place was called Taberah, which means burning, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. So this is going to be the pattern for these complaints in the wilderness. So basically, where did my eraser go? So you're going to have a complaint usually about food or water, okay? You got a complaint, you get an angry God, because of the complaint, and then you're going to get a punishment of some sort. Right here, it was parts of the camp were consumed by fire. But then what happens after the punishment starts? Moses. Yeah, remember Moses, the interceder. Moses is going to intercede in some way with God. He's going to pray. And then when he does, the bad stuff that was happening is limited. It stopped or lessened in some way. So punishment is limited. And then you get a name of some sort. Like here, they call the place where it happened Taberah, which means burning. And this happens over and over again. The place gets a name because here's where the fire of the Lord came out. And one place, here's where we all got sick after we ate the birds. And several like that along the line. So you get a name, which is like a marker for them to remember in the future what happened. All right? Yes? You think? Yes. And it hasn't been that long since he brought them out of slavery, right? And he held his staff over the Red Sea, and God parted the waters and saved them from being slaughtered by the armies of Egypt. It hasn't been that long when these first ones happened. So, yeah. He's definitely complaining about the people. Yes.
About not what God has done for them, but gave these people to me, whatever,
Yes.
they're not mine. Why do I have to carry them around and take care of them?
Yes.
And, he is whining to God about them, which he doesn't, his patience does get.
Yeah. Which I think we could all sympathize, right? But that's true. Starting in verse 10 of, we'll get there. But if you look on from where we read, verse 4. Now my translation calls them a rabble. Now the rabble, that is the complaining group, that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat." No. In Egypt, we had good stuff to eat. We had, and it was free there. Of course, I think everything they got in the wilderness was free too, but it was free. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt, the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up. There's nothing at all but this manna to look at. Remember the manna that's there every morning for them to eat. And then it goes on and it describes what manna is like in verse 7 and 8, what it looked like, what it tastes like, and so forth. If you know the different references there, you might get an idea. But they made cakes of it, and it tasted like cakes baked with oil. Is that good? Or I don't know. All right? But that's what they're sick of. They're sick of this manna. You remember what the word manna means? What is it? Yeah, what is this stuff, basically, when it first came? So then, to what Becky was referring to, verse 10, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent. Boy, he had good ears with all those hundreds of thousands of people. That may be where we get the word murmuring. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly. So he's mad again, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth that you should say to me, 'Carry them in your bosom,' as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give to their fathers?" Now here is God's chosen person in Israel. He's being pretty plain with God, is he not? You ever talk to God like this?
We said it before, he's the only one that God spoke to directly and
Yes.
without riddles and
Yes.
face to face.
They had a relationship.
He had relationships until he could, and God didn't strike him dead, so I guess he could.
Yeah. And I think that might say something to us about prayer. Moses didn't get in trouble with God until, remember, he took the glory for himself on that instance. He said, "Do I have to bring water out of this rock for you people?" And then instead of speaking to the rock, he smashed it with his rod, and God said, "Okay, Moses, you decided to take the glory for yourself. You don't get to go into the land." But as far as being bold like this, God doesn't seem to say, "You can't talk to me like that, Moses." It might say something to us about what we can do with God in prayer if we're willing to give him glory. We think it anyway. He knows what we're thinking, so we might as well say it. Moses says in verse 13, "Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me and say, 'Give us meat that we may eat.' I'm not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you'll treat me like this, kill me at once. If I find," would you say that to God? Whew. He could just, and Moses says, "If you're going to make me do this, just kill me." Remember the prophet who said that to God? Jonah. And God didn't grant him his wish either. Of course, Jonah was even further off base. But anyway, "If I find favor in your sight, kill me at once, I may not see my wretchedness." Then God responds to his prayer. He said, I can't handle these people alone. The next 20 verses or so, God gives him helpers. He sets up basically an eldership in Israel to help deal with these people over the next several verses, gives them some of the spirit that Moses had so that they have wisdom and work among the people. And not that Moses was totally relieved of everything, but God helps him here. And there's some interesting things that happen there that we won't go through, but that's the next section there. But notice at the end of that chapter, verse 31. So they've asked, they're tired of the manna. What do they want? Give us some meat. All right. So, you want meat? Israel, I'll give you some meat. Then a wind from the Lord sprang up, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the ground. How thick were these birds? About 33 feet of bird. Notice they have to travel a day to where it is. God's making them work. But it's just, there's more bird than they could ever consume. Quail. Anybody ever ate quail? I know that I've had quail eggs, but quail, I don't know. Is it okay? Tastes like chicken? Okay. Okay, well, this is what they get. Blows in off the sea. And the people rose all that day and all night and all the next day and gathered the quail. So all these millions of people, they're like, there's meat out there. Let's go. Those who gathered least gathered, my translation says, 10 homers, that is 12 bushels. It's a lot, right? I'm saying it's a big bunch. Okay. That's the ones who got the least. They got that much. And they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. So they've hauled it back to the camp. But notice, while the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people. And the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Therefore, the name of that place was called, and then there's a big long Hebrew word which means graves of craving, because they're going to die. They're going to be buried right there. Graves of gluttony. Yeah. And there they buried the people who had the craving. So again, you can sort of trace this pattern again. The complaints, God's upset, the punishment, and so forth, and the name. This is the first instance of this. It only gets worse, yes, with complaints and the rebellions as we track through. The next one we'll look at is the famous one with Korah. Not our Korah, but the Levite rebel Korah. Korah's rebellion in chapter 16. Okay? All right, we seem to run out of time so quickly. Yeah, while they're still eating. Yeah. Yeah, you almost feel guilty laughing at it, but it is ridiculous. The whole thing is ridiculous, no doubt.